So if you had to bet all your money on one camp or the other, would you say, do you err on the side of panpsychism, where consciousness is really fundamental to our to all of reality, or more on the other side, which is like it's a nice little side effect, a useful like hack for us humans
Mhm.
to survive? Where on that spectrum, where do you land when you think about consciousness, especially from an engineering perspective?
I'm truly agnostic on this point. I mean, I think it's kind of in coin toss mode for me. I don't know, and panpsychism is not so compelling to me. I mean, again, it just seems unfalsifiable. I wouldn't know how the universe would be different if panpsychism were true. It's just to remind people, panpsychism is this idea that consciousness may be pushed all the way down into the most fundamental constituents of matter. So there might be something that it's like to be an electron or a quark, but then you wouldn't expect anything to be different at the macro scale, or at least I wouldn't expect anything to be different. Um, so it may be unfalsifiable. It just might be that reality is not something we're as in touch with as we think we are, and that if at its base layer to kind of break it into mind and matter as we've done ontologically is to misconstrue it, right? I mean, there could be some kind of neutral monism at the bottom, and this idea doesn't originate with me. This goes all the way back to Bertrand Russell and others, 100 plus years ago. But I just feel like the concepts we're using to divide consciousness and matter may in fact be part of our problem, right? Where the rubber hits the road psychologically here are things like, well, what is death, right? Like, do we any expectation that we survive death or any part of us survives death? That really it seems to be the many people's concern here.
Well, I tend to believe, just as a small little tangent, like I'm with Ernest Becker on this, that there's some. It's interesting to think about death and consciousness. Which one is the chicken? Which one is the egg? Because it feels like death could be the very thing, like our knowledge of mortality could be the very thing that creates the consciousness.
Yeah,
That's
well, then you're using consciousness differently than I am. I mean, so for me, consciousness is just the fact that the lights are on at all, that there's an experiential quality to anything. So much of the processing that's happening in our brains right now certainly seems to be happening in the dark, right? Like it's not associated with this qualitative sense that
Mhm.
there's something that it's like to be that part of the mind doing that mental thing. Uh, but for other parts, the lights are on, and we can talk about, and whether we talk about it or not, we can feel directly that there's something that it's like to be us. There's something seems to be happening, right? And the seeming in our case is broken into vision and hearing and proprioception and um, taste and smell and thought and emotion. I mean, there are the contents of consciousness that we are familiar with and that we can have direct access to in any present moment, that when we're quote conscious. And even if we're confused about them, even if we're asleep and dreaming and it's not a lucid dream, we're just totally confused about our circumstance, what you can't say is that we're confused about consciousness. Like, you can't say that consciousness itself might be an illusion, because on this account it just means that things seem anyway at all. I mean, even like if this, it seems to me that I'm seeing a cup on the table. Now, I could be wrong about that. It could be a hologram. I could be asleep and dreaming. I could be hallucinating. But the seeming part isn't really up for grabs in terms of being an illusion. It's not. Something seems to be happening, and that seeming is the context in which every other thing we can notice about ourselves can be noticed, and it's also the context in which certain illusions can be cut through, because we can be wrong about what it's like to be us, and we can I'm not saying we're incorrigible with respect to our claims about the nature of our experience, but for instance, this, many people feel like they have a self and they feel like it has free will, and I'm quite sure at this point that they're wrong about that, and that you can cut through those experiences, and then things seem a different way, right? So it's not that things don't there aren't discoveries to be made there, and assumptions to be overturned, but um, this kind of consciousness is something that I would think it doesn't just come online when we get language. It doesn't just come online when we form a concept of death, or the finiteness of life. It doesn't require a sense of self, right? So it doesn't. It's prior to a differentiating self and other. Uh, and I wouldn't even think it's necessarily limited to people. I mean, I do think probably any mammal has this. But certainly, if you're going to presuppose that something about our brains is producing this, right, and that's a very safe assumption, even though we can't, even though you can argue the jury is still out to some degree, then it's very hard to draw a principled line between us and chimps, or chimps and rats, even in the end, given the underlying neural similarities. So, and I don't know, phylogenetically, I don't know how far back to push that. There are people who think single cells might be conscious, or that flies are certainly conscious. They've got something like 100,000 neurons in their brains. I mean, it's just there's a lot going on even in a fly, right? But I don't have intuitions about that.